De jure segregation is segregation enforced by law, while de facto segregation occurs when widespread individual preferences, sometimes backed up with private pressure, lead to separation. Jim Crow laws were state and local laws enforcing racial segregation in the southern United States. Literacy tests, grandfather clause, and poll taxes were a part of the voter registration process. Enacted after the Reconstruction period, these laws were enforced until 1965. The Black Codes were laws passed by the southern United States in 1865 and 1866 after the Civil War. These laws had the intent and the effect of restricting African Americans' freedom and of compelling them to work in a labor economy based on low wages or debt. In 1954, the year before Brown v. Board of Education, Emmett Till was an African American teenager who was lynched in Mississippi at the age of 14 after reportedly flirting with a white woman. His mother insisted on having an open casket to show the world the brutality of the killing. By the end of World War II, dramatic changes in American race relations were underway. The integration of labor unions in the 1930s under the eye of the Fair Employment Practices Commission and the desegregation of the armed forces by President Truman in 1948 marked major steps towards racial integration. The legal framework on which segregation rested, which was formally established in 1846 by the court's Plessy v. Ferguson decision, was itself being dismantled. Challenged repeatedly by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the doctrine of separate but equal was beginning to crack. Beginning in 1938, the Supreme Court had, in a number of cases, struck down laws where segregated facilities proved to be demonstrably unequal. However, the 1950s brought a new wave of challenges to official segregation by the NAACP and other groups. Linda Brown, an 8-year-old African-American girl, had been denied permission to attend an elementary school only 5 blocks from her home in Topeka, Kansas. School officials refused to register her at the nearby school and assigned her to a new school for non-white students some 21 blocks from her home. Separate elementary schools for whites and non-whites were maintained by the Board of Education of Topeka. Linda Brown's parents filed a lawsuit to force the school to admit her to the nearby but segregated school for white students. The central question addressed to the court involved the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Does segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race, even though the physical facilities and other tangible factors may be equal, deprive the children of equal educational opportunities? In short, the court was asked to determine whether the segregation of schools was at all constitutional. The argument for Linda Brown that was created was it was harmful to African American children to have segregation in schools as it was an unequal education which created a low self-esteem. For the Board of Education, the attorneys for Topeka argued that the schools were equal in every way, and that sometimes non-white schools had better programs because of funds specifically for Native Americans. Additionally, they argued that discrimination by race did not harm children in any way. When it comes to the decision and rationale, they determined that separation in schools was a denial of the equal protection laws. Blacks were not receiving the proper education that they deserved. Blacks and whites will no longer be separate in schools as it does not follow the 14th Amendment.
In the years following the Brown v. Board of Education case, there was a dramatic rise in the civil rights movement. 3 major factors include the television, for which the first time people were able to see events rather than just hearing about them. The rise of charismatic leadership such as Martin Luther King Jr., who led the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a nationwide organization still around today, who participated in nonviolent protests such as the Montgomery bus boycott and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee formed to give younger African Americans more of a voice in the civil rights movement. And lastly, the Black Church, which served as a place of shelter and comfort in the African American community. Simultaneously happening, Lyndon B. Johnson proposed the Great Society and John F. Kennedy proposed the New Frontier, which were both interested in pursuing civil rights for blacks. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1964 were both essential in promoting equality for African Americans. 62 years after the Brown versus Board of Education, we still see the Supreme Court ordering schools to desegregate. In Cleveland, Mississippi, a town of 12,000, school districts are still divided, and the abandoned Illinois Central Railroad tracks that run through the town serve as a line of demarcation. Schools on the west side are almost entirely white, whereas the east carries most of the African American population. Parents of the east side argue that their children don't receive equal educational opportunities compared to the other school districts, and the segregation has a negative impact on their children. The school board argues that despite the overall ethnicity within each district, the schools are essentially equal and the separation has maintained itself since the establishment of the town. After taking the case to the Supreme Court, it was decided that the integration of schools would be enforced and the segregation of the town would be put to rest. One school district of 3,600 students is composed of 67% blacks and 29% whites. In addition, 4 out of 11 schools in the East Side District consist of 90% or more black population. The hope is to racially integrate not only the school districts on the east side, but also the community itself.